We're holding on 39B2, which, by the way, by next week, we will be in volume 2 of the Art Scroll. It's amazing. We made it through the first volume of Pesachim. We'll be in the second volume. So good morning, everybody. 39B2 at the Mishnah. So now the Mishnah continues. The Mishnah continues and starts talking about how far we're going to drive ourselves crazy and worry about things possibly becoming chametz, specifically in the case of things possibly becoming waterlogged. That's really the whole thing Gemara that we're going to be doing today. We're worrying about things that become food, that could become waterlogged grains, that could become waterlogged, and by that thing it might become leaven, and we have to worry about chametz on Pesach. That's really the whole thing. Good morning, Isaac. Okay.
Good morning, Mike.
Okay, here we go. We do not soak bran for chickens, because by soaking the bran, obviously water goes into it, and we have to worry about that it's going to rise and become chametz, and you're going to have hana, benefit from chametz. Aval, but chultin, Abel Chultin, but we can go ahead and we can scald it. We're now on 39B3. So says the Mishnah Vaita, because scalding it by pounding hot water on it, it retards the leavening process. And that's the whole thing. So we're not going to worry that we're not so worried anymore that it might become chametz. Says the Mishnah Vaita. A woman may not soak bran to take with her to the baths. In other words, that was their soap. Bran has a rough exterior, so they used it to clean themselves up. And what it goes, and they obviously wet it. If she wets the actual bran, now we're worried about that it might become chametz. But she's allowed to rub it on her dry. So if the bran was left dry and she rubbed it on herself, even though she's wet, she just went to the bath and she's wet, im kolzeh, there's not enough moisture for us to worry about that it might become chametz. By the way, from here you see that Jews have always been facetious. Most of the world at that time and until modern times took a bath twice in their lifetimes, when they were born and when they passed away. Jews, obviously the women took baths all the time, and so did the men because there were mikvahs. Tum and Tahara meant that they were taking baths all the time, which explains why in the Black Plague, the Jews were blamed that they weren't dying at the rates that the Goyim were, because the Jews were being extraordinarily clean, not abnormally clean, in the normal way of things, which the Goyim were not. That's just an historical fact that pops up throughout Shas, where it was very clear that we were, in the words of Rabbi Gamliel, Istinis Anochi. I'm very facetious. So, says the Mishnah Baita, Lo yilos odom chitin v'yaniach al makasai. A person shall not take wheat grains and chew on them, thereby getting saliva into the grains and then placing it on his hand as a wound, and placing it on a wound for Pesach, because again, the moisture from the saliva we're worried about will go inside and might make him a chametz. Because all of these become chametz. So says the Gemara, Tanu Rabbanon, these are the things that even if you put it into water, they come into contact with the water, we're not going to worry about that they're going to become leaven. What are we talking about? Ha'afu, something that's cooked. V'hamavushal, something that's baked. Ha'afu is something that's baked. V'hamavushal, something that's cooked. V'cholov shecholov b'roischin, and something which is scalded, which is specifically scalded in boiling water. So right away the Gemara asks, mavushal, cooked, you're not going to worry about chametz? What are you talking about? That is the whole thing we're always worried about. that in the process of cooking, it will rise and become chametz. So says the Gemara, Amar Papa, ha'afu shebishloi ka'ama. We're talking about something that was baked, and now you're putting it in, and now you're putting it into the oven, and now you're going to cook it. You baked it in the oven, and now you're going to cook it, which means we're learning over here the halacha, which we know from Shabbos, that ein bishul acher bishul. There is no cooking after cooking. So we have a rule. Once something is cooked up on Shabbos, okay, once something is cooked up on Shabbos, we don't worry about that you can further cook it. If it's completely cooked, you don't worry about it's going to be further cooked on Shabbos. And we're going to get a little more into this because in today's Gemara, we're going to bang into the concept of Keli Rishon, the Keli Sheni. A first vessel and a second vessel, which is again a Shabbos concept, that a first vessel where water is put directly into a first vessel, that vessel retains its heat. And so if something was thrown into it, we have to worry about that it's being cooked up on Shabbos, which you're not allowed to cook on Shabbos. But if you take it and you pour it into a second vessel, a Keli Sheni, the heat already leaves it, and then if something should fall into it, we don't worry. So this is all part and parcel. We're using Shabbos to explain things that we're going to worry about that might become chametz on Pesach. So Amar Papa, here, afu should be shleikama, something that was baked, and now you want to cook it as well. We're not worrying about it because ain't bishul akabishul. There's no cooking after cooking. Tanya, Rabbi Yosef, Rabbi Yehuda, kemach shenofa l'soichei delef, flour into which dripping water, drop, fell, afilu kolayon kulai, even if it dripped and dripped and dripped in there all day long into this flour, einabol l'dei chimutz. And explains Rav Papa, Amar Rav Papa, v'hu da'ovid tif lahade tif. When the drop. In other words, it was dripping non-stop. Because as we learned by the Menachos a few days ago, they used to pound it 500 times and rub it 300 times. The pounding retards the leavening process. So if it's a Chinese torture of a drip, right onto the thing, that is not a problem because that doesn't allow it to leaven. If it's drip and there's a 5-second interval between each drip, then I got to worry about that it may have risen. Ami debei Rav Shilo, the vatika shari, and something called vatika, some type of food made of flour, is mutar on Pesach. But Tanya, we learned vatika aser. What are you talking about? Vatika is forbidden on Pesach. This is the case where Rav Shilo says you're allowed to make vatika on Pesach, where you prepare it with oil and salt. Oil is considered fruit juices, mei peris. And according to this Mandiyama, mei peris, fruit juices do not, contribute to the leavening process, or they take a very long time to leaven, so I'm not worried about it, it'll be gone by then. And the other case where we say you're not allowed to make vatika on Pesach is where you make it with water and salt. Water, obviously, is the great leavening agent. We are now on 39b4. One should not make the broth thicker. Shouldn't make it thicker, thickening the pot, even with flour of oven-dried grain. Because what's the issue with oven-dried grain? They're like popcorn. As you all know, you can stick the popcorn into the microwave, but no matter what, there's always kernels that don't quite pop. Same thing over here. Maybe they will not have been baked properly. All these oven-dried grains, you're not going to get to all of them. Some of them will not be baked properly. And now, so now I got to worry about that when you put water into it, right, that some of them weren't actually cooked up, and therefore water is going to get into the non-cooked up oven grains, and thereby it gets soaked into the grains and be mechametz and leaven up the grains. Amar Rabbi Yosef, Lechilut inchi, one should not scald boiling water. We are daf mem, daf 40, 40a1. Even though we just said before you're allowed to go ahead and pour hot water, boiling water. Still, don't pour even hot water, in which cases, trei chiti bahadi adodi, 2 kernels of wheat, one on top of each other, because maybe one kernel will shift and end up in the cleft of the second one, because there are clefts within the wheat. And the bubbling of the boiling water won't get to all 4 sides, because one of them is sort of glued to the other one, where they gets pasted together from one cleft into the other. And if it's not boiled up on all 4 sides, the water will be able to get in and possibly make it rise. And this is even on wheat, which is very hard, and it's much harder for the water to get into wheat as opposed to, let's say, barley. One should not singe, fire up quickly 2 stalks of grains together. Because moisture from the stalks may seep out of one of them and go into the other. From one stalk, some of the sap from one stalk will seep out of it and seep into the other one. Which means, by the way, that Abaye seems to be holding that may peiros, the liquids of fruits, i.e., not water, that may peiros does contribute to the leavening, because otherwise you wouldn't have a problem here. And in fact, Amalei Rava, in that case, you shouldn't even be able to singe even one stalk. Because maybe the stalk on the top of the stalk will seep out, and the seepage will go into the lower part of the stalk of the stalk, and thereby being mechametz and leavening up the other side of the stalk. Elo may peiros ninu. This is the juice of fruit juices. May peiros ena machmitzin, and may peiros does not leaven. When we say may peiros, it doesn't actually mean fruits. It means anything that's not obviously water. We've known this before, right? Oil, etc. Called under that Rubicon. Honey is under the Rubicon of may peiros. So, and in fact, Abaye reversed field, and he said as just the opposite. In fact, as long as the liquids are flowing, as long as the sap is coming out, it does not cause things to rise and become chametz, because while it's in motion, Rashi explains, it doesn't have the power to leaven. The Omar Abaye, this jug, this vessel that you use for toasting grain. So you fill up the vessel with grains and you put it over a fire to toast. If the vessel is inverted so that it's actually upside down, so that the liquids inside, the sap that comes out of the grains, runs out of the vessel, no problem. I'm not worried about things becoming chametz on Pesach. The kifa also, if it's upright, if it's the regular way, so that the liquids, the sap that comes out, settles on the bottom of the vessel, then I have to worry about that liquid went into the grains and might have been mechametz them. Rava Amar, no. Afilu zikifa nami shari. Even if it's standing upright, it's still good, because may peiros ninu, it's fruit juice. May peiros eino mechametz, and may peiros do not contribute to the leavening process. Tanu Rabbanon, ein loisnin shi'oirim b'Pesach. You're not allowed to soak barley grains in water on Pesach. We're worried about water's going to get in. The im lace, but what happens if you did soak it? What's the halacha? Niskapu asuras. If the grains split, if the barley got so filled up with water that it cracked open, right? Then obviously it's no good, because then it will rise very, very quickly. If you cook it up, it will rise very, very quickly, and it will become chametz. Loy nisbaktu muteris. But if they did not split, they are permitted to be used, because then they will not rise so quickly. And by the time you finish cooking it, it will not have risen. Rabbi Yosi Omer, if you want to retard the leavening process, so if you see your beans begin to rise, okay, you begin to see your beans begin to rise. Okay, so they're swelling, but they haven't cracked yet. This is what you should do. Shuran b'chaimitz, run and soak them in vinegar. V'chaimitz sumosan. And what it will do is it will retard the vinegar. The vinegar will actually go ahead and act as a contracting agent. What vinegar will do is, if your barley beans, your barley grains are swelling and you're afraid they're going to crack and become no good on Pesach, soak them in vinegar. Vinegar will drain them and contract them. Now, just before we go further, this obviously in modern times, this whole Gemara really is really not understandable. Go to the store, you buy the stuff, but then it just needs to be pointed out. The process was so much more difficult, and it was up to modern times. You had to harvest it, you had to clean it, you had to bring it, and you had to get it to a person. There were no stores selling things the way we think about selling, right? There was no mass production. There was no packaging. So therefore, when you had grains or beans or whatever it is, each one of them was precious. What we don't think about twice today, they thought about. Because if they got ruined, it was a complete financial loss. It was a much different way of living, and it was very much that way 100 years ago. Before the advent of, a little over 100 years, before the advent of transportation. We don't even think about logistics. Jerry, who's here, could tell you what the business that Jerry's in could never have existed 100 years ago, because you need trucking. You need you need refrigerated trucks, etc. So we should always keep that in mind and learning these Gemaras where you think it's a little nuts what they're worried about here, until you realize, in fact, through most of human history, it's exactly what they're worried about. The chiddush, the novelty, is that we don't worry about it anymore. Anyways, Amar Shmuel says, Shmuel, Ein halacha ki Rabbi Yosi. The halacha is not like Rabbi Yosi, and in fact, vinegar will not stop it will not stop the leavening process from going forward. It's just very interesting to know that Shmuel is the scientist of Shas. All throughout Shas, we will bang into the fact that Shmuel is considered is the doctor. He's always giving medical advice. He's always giving the thing. And in fact, is a very interesting story. There's a Gemara in Masechta Shabbos Daf Kuf Ches, where Shmuel happens to say, Amar Shmuel, Tuva Tipas Sainen, it's good, cold water in the morning, Shachris V'rechitas Yadayim V'reglayim B'chamen, in the morning to take cold water and put it on your eyes in the morning. And in the night, that the cold Kulyin Shabbalim, then any creams or any creams of in the world. So on this, one time, the Stipler, it's brought down in the Sefer, Orchos Rabbeinu, stories of our Rebbe, the great Stipler, the Stipler Goyim was once asked about a refuah for somebody who was having problems with the eyes. And he said, Mikublani me Professor Godel, and I was Makabal, I accepted from a great professor, Sherefuah is Lamochel Einayim, that refuah is for eye ailments, Lirchitz Kama Pa'omim Eseinayim is to wash the eyes many times, with cold water. And this is the refuah for all machlas and this is the refuah for all eye ailments. So he said, I heard from a great professor. So the Rosh Yeshiva of Tarbidas said, that Rabbi Reisman said, he was talking, of course, about Shmuel and his halacha, but he figured, the Stipler figured that if he told the person that it was Shmuel in the Gemara, he wouldn't listen to him. So when he told him Professor Godol, he figured this way he'll listen to him. So Shmuel, even the Stipler called him the great professor. So the great professor, the one who said, what are you talking about? I know vinegar, and vinegar will not retard the leavening process. Weiter. Amar Rav Chizda Amar Marukvo. Loinis baktu mamish. When the Brisa talks about the grain splitting, it doesn't actually mean splitting. Ela kol she'ilu menichan agabi chavis. But it means all grains that have swelled, and if you replace them over the mouth of a wine bottle, the vapors of the wine, vehem niskaptu me'alein, and they would split on their own because of the vapors that were rising out of the wine bottle, that's enough that we now have to worry about things becoming chametz. We are on 48:2. The Shmuel Oma nisbaktu mamish. No, the Brisa means exactly what it said. If it splits, we've got a problem. If they don't split, we don't have a problem. Ovad Shmuel, and Shmuel actually paskin this way. Uvdu beduro the Beir Bar Choshu in the household of Rav Choshu nisbaktu mamish. It was a case where where their grains got all wetted, and he said, "Don't worry, because they did not split." Omer Rabbo, Baal Nefesh Lo Yiltosh. A conscientious person should not soak grain on Pesach. What's a conscientious person? A chosid, a pious person, or a chover, somebody who's very conscientious, very careful, like we had before, about everything that he touches. My area Baal Nefesh. Why does Rabbi go out of his way to say a Baal Nefesh, a conscientious person? Afilu kula arbanami. Everybody's not allowed to soak the hot tiny, because we learned in the Brisa said before, ain't loisin shurim b'Pesach. You're not allowed to soak barley and water on Pesach. So the Gemara, Chikama, Baal Nefesh, a conscientious person, not just barley, afilu chitin d'shiririn lo yiltosh. Even wheat, which is hard, and it's hard for water to get into the wheat, in kolzeh, don't soak the wheat, because we worry about it might be getting the water getting in there and making it chametz. Amalei Rav Nachman, man d'tzayis le'la'aba, one who heeds father's words, Abba, which is a nickname for Rabba. Rabba was called Abba in many places in Shas. Ochul namo di'ifusha, will end up eating spoiled bread, because what's going to get mixed up in it? If you're not allowed to put any water into the wheat and all that, and when they're still in the stalks, you'll end up with all the bran and pieces of the husk in your flour. The hog beirav lasasi, because in fact in the house of Rav Huna they would soak wheat on Pesach to clean it out. In the house of Rav Marava they would also clean it out. The Rav Oma also lutosh, and Rav says nope, it's also to soak even wheat on Pesach. Now, Zakti Gemara, is that a fact? Elohad Tanya ein loisin siorim bePesach. You shall not soak barley on Pesach. Sa'orin udaloi. This that the Brisa said you shouldn't soak is that barley shouldn't be soaked. Sa'orin udaloi hachitin sorry. That means barley shouldn't be soaked, but wheat is permissible. So Zakti Gemara, no, the Brisa has to be read like this. Loi mi boyakam. That there's not just this, but certainly this. Loi mi boyachitin. No question that it's also to soak wheat grains on Pesach, even the isbeit cereal, because they have clefts in them. Like we said before, two wheat stalks shouldn't lay one on top of each other, because one could go into the cleft of the other. Since wheats have clefts in them, it's pretty easy for water to enter them and get soaked in them and create the leavening process. But barley grains, which are smooth, the grains of barley are smooth. I might have said it's okay to soak the barley on Pesach because the water doesn't have a very easy way of getting in. Kamash Malon, we still worry about it. And in fact, Hada Amar Rava. Rava went ahead and backed up. So let's remember this. Rava started by saying, Asa Liltais. It's usher, it's forbidden to soak. Now Rava starts changing his mind. Hada Amar Rava, he says, Muta Liltais. It's okay. You know what? If you want to soak it, it's fine. You can soak it. Why? Says Rava. Why did I change my mind to say if you want to soak it, you can soak it? The time because we learned. Yoitzin b'pasnikia. One could fulfill his obligation of eating matzah with clean flour, i.e., white bread flour, like we're used to, and vadra, and as well with coarse bread, 7-grain bread, whole wheat bread. It's okay. That kind, you can do that too. That kind of grain. The efshenikia, and regarding white bread, right? Regarding white clean flour, efshenikia, it's impossible to have clean flour below lisi. So without first soaking the grains beforehand to remove all the bran. So you see from over here that obviously you're allowed to soak the wheat. Zakti Gemara, Eser Rapapala Rava, what do you say? Regarding, as you remember, all food items, okay? All food items, to remind everybody, have to first be mekushal and mekabel tumah, have to be prepared to become susceptible to be mekabel tumah. They have to be wetted. All food items have to be wetted by one of the 7 liquids that the Torah labels out. One of the 7 liquids have to be used to first wet the food item, which then makes it ready. Royal mekabel tumah, hukshul mekabel tumah, be ready to be susceptible to mekabel tumah. So here's a case where we had kamachim usaloses, flour, and soiles, which is fine flour. Okay, fine flour of non-Jews. Shalnachim. The question is, do we have to worry about these being susceptible to be mekabel tumah? So he said like this: Shel kifarim tahirim. The small villages are considered tahar, pure. Why? As Rashi explains, because the villages aren't so facetious, they're not so clean. They don't always wash their food before dealing with it. So I don't have to worry. So therefore, if they're not wet, right? They're not prepared yet. And therefore they're not susceptible to becoming tummy. Okay, we're on 48.3. Vishel kirakim tamayim, but from the cities where they're much more facetious and they wet and they wash their stuff before, when it comes to food stuff, they wash this up first. Now I got to worry about that. Now it's wet, therefore it's susceptible to tumah, and it's considered tumah. The guy's stuff is considered tumah. To Zakti Gemara, the kafar in my time. What's the reason that the flour of villages is considered not a problem? We're not going to worry about it becoming tumah. La mishum deloy leisib. It's because they don't soak the grains. But you see what? That it's still called siles, kimochin, which is regular flour, usilosois, siles, which is fine flour. So you see that the fine flour of the villages is still called fine flour, even though it wasn't soaked. So you see, you could make fine flour, clean white bread flour, even without soaking the wheat, the grains beforehand. So it's a question on Rava who said, I'm allowing you to soak the wheat because you're allowed to use fine flour, clean flour make the matzah on Pesach, and it can't get it cleaned unless you soak it. Here's proof that you don't have to soak it in order to make it clean. So the Gemara, Kimcha, explained the Brisa that when it comes to the village, we're only talking about plain flour and not the better flour, the white flour. Basa denofik, and then Rava went out. So Rava started with what originally you're not allowed to soak. Then he said it's okay, you could soak because you're allowed to use clean thing. He went to Basa denofik. So again, Rava went out. Omar Rav Papa said, we should have told him, why didn't I say to him the following statement that would have really backed him into a corner? The Omar Rav Zeh, Omar Rabbi Yemi Shmuel, Chitin Shal Menacha is the wheat grains of Menachis. Once again, the Menachis offerings were the grain offerings that were brought, the various grain offerings brought in different kind of frying pans, either a deep pan or a flat pan, But either way, the grains that were used to make that flour, Minatayra were not allowed to be soaked, and yet the Torah calls them soiles mincha, belula bashemen, soiles mincha. The flour of the mincha, the fine flour of the mincha, was needed in shemen, in oil. So you see that it's referred to as fine flour, even though it was not allowed to be soaked. So Rava went in and said, now, by the way, it means, of course, that Rav Papa holds that, in fact, Rav Papa holds that May Paris, the fruit juices do leaven, because the menachos were needed in water, in oil, not water. And Rava actually, as we learned before, holds May Paris do not mechametz, do not leaven. But anyways, look where it goes here. Hada Amar Rava. So again, Rava started with you're not allowed to soak at all. Then he said it's okay to soak because that way you can make white bread, clean flour. Hada Amar Rava mitzvah lelitos. It's actually a mitzvah to soak the grains in preparation of matzah. I want you to. By the way, this means that Rava did not use whole wheat matzahs. Okay, he only used good old-fashioned white matzahs, okay, which is a question how today we use whole wheat matzahs. Shenema ushmartem es hamatzahs. And the pasuk said you shall guard the matzahs. What does this mean? If it wasn't for the fact that the grains needed to be soaked in preparation to be made into flour, that means when you cut them at the time of the harvest, you're going to throw them into water to clean them out in order to that, so that when you grind them down to make the flour, they're clean. Shimulamai. If you didn't put it into water right after it was harvested, right, then what shimulamai? What watching would you need? And if you're going to say shimudelisha, no, shayman means that from the point that it starts getting kneaded into the water, that the flour starts getting kneaded into the water. Okay, we have to be careful. We have to watch it to make sure it doesn't become chametz. Shimu delisha lav shimu, because guarding during kneading is not considered guarding, as Rabbi explains. The Amar of regarding those of the goyim that have not yet become chametz. So goyim happen to have made dough, okay, and it was not chametz yet. A person is allowed to fill his stomach with them on the first night of Pesach. Why such an interesting lashon? He can fill his stomach with them because of the next words. Provided that he eats at least one piece of matzah the size of an olive, has an olive's volume at the end, because he has to eat one matzah that was made by a Jew in order to be mekayim the mitzvah, in order to fulfill his obligation of eating matzah the first night of Pesach. Zok the Gemara, and the reason for that is because shemartem es hamatzis. You have to watch the matzahs. They have to be watched l'shem mitzvahs matzah. L'shem in the name of the mitzvah of matzah. If you've ever been to a matzah bakery, you will hear those words constantly. L'shem mitzvahs matzah, as they're putting the matzah in, as they're rolling the dough. L'shem mitzvahs matzah. Every process of the thing has to go l'shem in the name of the mitzvah of matzah. And obviously, dough made by a guy is not done l'shem mitzvahs matzah. It's not made in the name of the mitzvah of matzah. The Gemara says, in that the final matzah has to be from a Jew in order to be mekayim your mitzvah of eating matzah the first night of Pesach. Very shayna loy, but at the beginning he does not, because those matzahs that he got from a guy, right, he does not fulfill his obligation to be matzah on the first night of Pesach. My tama, why doesn't he fulfill his mitzvah from the Gentiles' dough? It wasn't chametz. So what's exactly the problem? Mishum deloy aved behu shimur, because he didn't guard it. He didn't guard the matzah. for the express purpose of being Mikayim L'Shem Mitzvah Matzah, for the name of the mitzvah of matzah. So Zakti Gemara, but what are you talking about? Let him guard it from the moment that he prepares it to baking and onwards, which would make it therefore fit for the mitzvah. Elolav Shmamino Shimomi Kara Be'inan. From here you see that guarding is required from the beginning, even before the kneading process begins. From the we call it in Hebrew in the lashon of the Gemara, Shemira Bishas Kitzira, watching from the time of the cutting, of the harvesting. The watching has to begin from the moment it's coming out of the field. From the moment you cut it in the field, that wheat and everything else has to be watched. Okay, we are on 48.4. Umimai, from where do you know that? What it Umimai Dilma Shani Shani Hosam, the Beina the Nochis of the Shimor, for at the time that it entered the state of being guarded. In other words, at the time that the water was first added to the flour to make the dough, which at that point you want to watch it, Loy Ovid Loy Shimor. He wasn't guarding it. The dough was the guy's dough. So who made the dough? The guy made the dough. The guy is the one who put the water in and kneaded the flour into dough. So, the guy everybody agrees from the time of kneading, it needs watching. L'shem mitzvah matzah. And here we're saying the guy is the one who produced the dough. I got the guy's dough. Well, then in that case, that's a problem. But if at the time it ended, that it was watched, Ovidle Shimor, he did in fact got it. So in other words, he didn't get the dough from the guy, he got the wheat from the guy, etc. That that guarding it during kneading is considered guarded, and it is. So in other words, it's true by the time when the wheat was cut in the field, he wasn't watching it, but he got the grains raw before they were kneaded at all. So maybe from that moment on, it's perfectly fine, and you don't have to watch it from the moment of Ketzira, from the moment that you harvest it. But even so, Rava did not back out of his opinion to Amalahu, because he said, for those who were taking the sieves of the grain, and they were turning it over to shake out the brands and bundling them up into bundles in order to transport them to where they had to go. He said to them, Ki mehapchisu, when you turn them over, hapchisu l'shum mitzvah, turn it over for the purpose of the mitzvah of matzah. Say l'shem mitzvahs matzah. Alma kesovar. Therefore, we see that Rava holds shimu mi'ikar mitchisa b'tchilasa v'atzayfa b'ina, that you need watching for the sake of the mitzvah matzah from the beginning, from the harvesting all the way to the end. And that, by the way, is the way we hold. That is the way we hold. Mar Berei de Ravina, Ramar, the son of Ravina. We're now on Omid Beis. We're getting to the Mishnah. Minaktole ime ba'arba. His mother would store grain for him in buckets. And Rashi says right on top, Chitin chilas kitzir l'tzarech haPesach. The wheat that would, from the beginning of the harvest, that would cut, she would immediately separate and say, these are for Pesach. So this is exactly the point that you have to have in mind the mitzvah of matzah immediately from the beginning of the cutting process. Zok Gemara Baita. Ahu arba dechiti. There was a ship that was filled with wheat. Then the tova b'chishta, that sank in the river Chishta. So what happened? Of course, the wheat got all soaked with water. Shaya Ravel is the Bune Lenochrim. Ravos permitted the salvaged wheat to be sold to Goyim, but not to the Jews, since it was Chometz, obviously, and it was very close to Pesach. He said you could only sell it to the Goyim. Frank the Gemara, so Rabbi Baloi Rava, but Rabbi Baloi asked Rava, said there's a brisa that seems to say just the opposite. Beged she'ava by kalayim, a beged in which kalayim was lost. We all know the rule of shatnez. You're not allowed to have in your clothes find the linen threads that were put into it. Okay, for some reason you couldn't find it. Zok the Gemara, Harei zeh lo yimchu l'nochri. You shall not sell this beged, this clothing to a guy, because the guy might turn around and sell it to a Jew. And since it's not clear that there is shatnez in this beged, the Jew might inadvertently come to wear shatnez from a thing that he bought from a guy. And you shouldn't use it to make a saddle for a donkey, even though a saddle is usually very hard when you sit on it. But because we're worried about over here that you might go ahead and take a small piece off the saddle and use it as a patch on your clothing if it gets a hole. And in that case, it turns out you're now going in and wearing a patch that might have the shatnez in it. But you are allowed to make it for a shroud for a mace, because a mace is something that's used for a mace is never allowed to be reused. As it were, the mace requires ownership of it, and it's not allowed to be reused at all. So Zakti Gemara. So therefore, I'm not worried about it, but you might come to use it to make a patch. So the Gemara Lenochi, my Tamaloi. What's the reason you're not allowed to sell it to a guy? Because I'm afraid that he might turn around and sell the same beged, the same article of clothes to a Yid, to a Jew, who will not know that there's shatnez in it. If that's the case, why did Rava allow the soaked wheat that was sunk in the river to be sold to Goyim before Pesach? The Goy might turn around and sell this wheat to a Jew. Rava said, you're right. Lizabinu kabo Yisrael. Sell it 1 grain at a time to Jews, so that it will be all consumed before Pesach. That's what I do. By the way, one should take a great musahaska from here, a great lesson. Rava, as you can see in this Gemara here, has been changing his mind a lot. And this teaches, of course, one should never be so complete set in your ways that you're not willing to change your mind when other truths become apparent. We're not allowed to add flour to a cooking pot on Pesach. Not a cooked pot, but a cooking pot. Because a cooked pot is ein bishul acha bishul. There's no cooking after cooking. So if I add something else into something that's already cooked, I'm not worried about it. Obviously, not in its first keli, not in the keli risha, but in the keli sheni, as we're about to see. But here it's cooking. But if one wants to add flour, this is what he should do. He should put the flour first, and now we're on 40b2. And afterwards add the vinegar. Okay, and therefore the vinegar, according to this Yoba, will retard the leavening process. But if you do it the other way, if you put the vinegar first in and then the flour, it's not going to work. Another says, no, even if you put the vinegar first and then you put the kemach, it's okay. The vinegar will act as a retard will retard the leavening process.
I thought Shmuel said it doesn't work.
Correct. Here they say he's arguing. The Rabbanan are arguing.
All right.
Exactly. Don't worry about it. We're going to find. Remember, we started with oven-dried grains. You're not supposed to, what do you call it? Wait until we get to right before the Mishnah. We're getting there in a minute. Man Yeshayimrim. Who is the Yeshayimrim? Amar Rav Chizda, Amar Rabbi Yehudi. It's Rabbi Yehuda. The Tanya, because he to learn regarding Bishul B'Shabbos, regarding cooking on Shabbos. Now we say like this: regarding a frying pan or a pot which was removed from the fire. So it was the original vessel that was sitting on the fire, otherwise known as the Keli Rishon, the first Keli, the first vessel that was sitting on the fire. So he removed the frying pan or the pot from the fire while it was still boiling. You're not allowed to add spices to them. Avol, and I'm putting in the words, if you take the stuff from the first pot and you put it into a keli sheni, you pour it into a keli sheni, into a second pot, you're allowed to noisen l'soichai hakadera. You can add spices into a bowl, or l'soicha tamchui, or into a tureen that contains hot liquids. So the example of this would be if you want to make a coffee, right? Now it happens to be instant coffee is already cooked, and therefore there's no ein bishul acha bishul, but it is the habit of us to do this anyways. We take from our hot water urn, we put it into a cup. Now it happens to be that the hot water urn is really the keli rishon, the first keli. We put it into a cup, into the cup that's a keli sheni, and we have the thing that we take the cup and we pour the hot water into another cup, creating a keli shlishi, which clearly will not cook anything up, okay? But that's the reality of it. In fact, there's an argument to say that if you have the old-fashioned hot water urn, where you have the black piece sticking out and you press the mouth to let the water out, since that plastic piece is a separate piece than the actual urn. There's the urn, and then there's the black piece. The black piece is already a keli sheni, so by the time it gets into your cup, it's already a keli shlishi, right? But this is what they're saying over here. If you pour the stuff originally out of the first into a second keli, into a second vessel, then you can add stuff to it, which means that it will not cook up with regard to Shabbos, which also means that regard to chametz, it will not cook it up in order to be mechametzit, in order for it to become leaven. Rabbi Yehuda Omer, l'chol hu noising. Into any keli sheni, you're allowed to add whatever spices you want. Chutz, except midava sheyesh bo chometz utzir, except for something that contains vinegar or fish brine. Since they're both sharp, anything sharp goes ahead and helps with the leavening process. So there's clearly a machlokes of what vinegar does. Zakti Gemara, v'nuk meke Rabbi Yosi. Why do you have to come on to all of this? Let's learn like Rabbi Yosi. The Tanya, Rabbi Yosi Omer, Shayrim v'chaymitz. We said this before. If the soaked barley is swelling but didn't crack yet, just say what it called. Put it, soak it in vinegar. V'chaymitz son, and the vinegar actually will make it contract. Will act as a retardation to the leavening process. Says the Gemara, Ki Ashminin Lo Rabbi Yosef. When do I hear Rabbi Yosef say that vinegar prevents it from rising? That's when the vinegar is intact, it's undiluted, it's just the vinegar. But if it's part of a mixture, then it already loses its potency, and then it won't stop the leavening process. Also, whether the vinegar goes in before the flour, or whether the flour goes into the pot before the vinegar, you do not use it on Pesach. Mishum, lech agrinim in the zero. Go away, we say to the Nazir. Sechar, go around. Lechar maloi sikra, don't even approach the vineyard. In other words, we're saying, when it comes to mitzvahs, don't go ahead and put yourself in a dangerous position. We're not believers in putting yourself in the positions where you might come to chas v'sholom b'over on avera. Stay away from the problem in the first place. Okay? Don't bring yourself close. Rapapi shorele levurdike debere shkelusa. Rapapi once gave permission for the bakers in the house of the Reish Galusa. The Reish Galusa, after the Churban Bayesheni, was like the prince that represented Klal Yisrael to the government in Rome. Lemilcha kedero b'chasisi. He allowed them to thicken up a pot with flour made of oven-dried grains. Omarava iked deshari ki hai milsa. Is anybody allowed such a thing to have it bedukta the shchiche avida in a place where slaves are common? Since the Reish Galusa had a lot of slaves, had a lot of servants, and servants aren't as particular to pay attention. So by definition, how could you soak the oven-dried grains? Ikediamri, right? The Amri that Rav himself, that Rav himself would thicken a pot with flour of oven-dried grains. The problem with all this is that we began the day today about 7 minutes late by starting off the Gemara that said oven-dried grains are not to be soaked because not all of them are baked, are cooked up properly like the popcorn kernels. So what's going on here? So if you look at the bottom Tosfos on the page, Rava Mochile Kedera B'Chasisi. So it's up to Gemara. Pirisha Kunchas B'Kimcha De Avishuna. This is oven-dried grains. The kosher, how can it's a question? The whole le'el, which we started the daf today, daf lamet tes amid beis, asirin v'lekaman the poluk. We said it's also to go ahead and cook up, to put it into water, oven-dried grains. V'nira l'ri, that we have the wrong words here, the pirish ba'aruch, like it's explained in the aruch. V'chasisi kemach shaladoshim is kemach, the grains of legumes, of beans. The ain't darkem lovely the chimutz kolkach, who in fact do not regularly become chametz, and the Rosh says straight out that in fact kemach shaladoshim, the grains of legumes, in fact never become chametz, and that's what we're saying. And we're not worried about that a person might switch the flour of legumes for better types of flours. That we're not worried about. Okay, and now we are at the Mishnah, and we pick it up tomorrow. Could we talk about tomorrow, by the way? What time would you guys like to learn? 7 or 9? Because I know davening is at 8 o'clock tomorrow.